High in the Colorado Rockies, where winter temperatures plunged to 40 below and propane cost more than gold, 16-year-old Marcus Chen was known as the kid who talked to rocks. For 3 summers, neighbors watched him dig what they called gopher holes around his family's remote cabin, muttering about thermal dynamics and geothermal loops. The local hardware store owner called it a waste of time. His classmates posted videos mocking his crazy tunnel system online. But Marcus wasn't just some mountain kid with too much time on his hands. His father had been a geothermal engineer before the accident, and those late-night conversations about earth temperatures and heat exchange had planted seeds in a brilliant young mind. When the propane truck couldn't make it up the mountain road for 6 weeks straight, and when Mrs. Patterson's elderly husband started showing signs of hypothermia, Marcus's useless tunnels became the difference between life and death. His system worked so well that energy companies are now knocking on his door. But what Marcus discovered buried deep in those tunnels might change everything we know about sustainable heating. The first snow had fallen 3 weeks early that October, and it hadn't stopped since. Marcus stood at his bedroom window, watching the white cascade blur the mountain peaks into ghostly silhouettes. The thermometer outside read -18, and it was only November. "Marcus, come eat," his mother's voice echoed through their small cabin, warm and inviting despite the Arctic conditions pressing against their walls. He padded downstairs in wool socks, finding his mother ladling steaming soup into ceramic bowls. The kitchen was toasty, almost tropical compared to the frozen wasteland outside. While other families huddled around wood stoves or rationed their dwindling propane supplies, the Chen cabin remained a pocket of comfortable warmth. "The radio's saying this could be the worst winter on record," his mother said, setting a bowl before him. "Temperatures haven't been this low since 1979. Marcus nodded, slurping the hot broth. Through the window, he could see smoke rising from the Patterson cabin a quarter-mile down the ridge. Too much smoke, actually. They were burning through their wood supply too fast. His phone buzzed with a text from his classmate Jake. "Hey, tunnel boy, how's your hamster maze working out?" Marcus deleted it without responding. Let them laugh. While Pine Ridge High ran on backup generators and half the town dealt with frozen pipes, he was sitting in 72-degree comfort, powered by the earth itself. The system had taken 3 summers to complete. Miles of carefully angled tubes snaked 6 feet underground around their property, where the earth maintained a constant 55 degrees year-round. A small pump circulated water through the closed loop, absorbing the earth's heat and carrying it back to a heat exchanger in their basement. Simple physics his father had explained during those precious conversations before the avalanche took him. "The earth is a battery," his father had said one evening, sketching diagrams on napkins. "It stores solar energy all summer, waiting for us to tap into it. Most people just don't know how to ask nicely." Marcus had been 13 then, hungry for any project that kept his father's memory alive. What started as grief therapy had evolved into something extraordinary. His phone rang. Mrs. Patterson. "Marcus, honey, I'm sorry to bother you." Her voice trembled with more than cold. "It's Harold. He's not responding right well to the cold. I called Doc Williams, but he can't get up the mountain with this storm." Marcus was already reaching for his boots. "I'll be right over." He grabbed his emergency kit, thermal blankets, hand warmers, a thermos of hot tea, and trudged through knee-deep snow to the Patterson place. The wind cut through his jacket like frozen razors. He found Harold Patterson unconscious in his recliner, his lips tinged blue despite being bundled in every blanket they owned. The cabin's interior was barely 40 degrees. Their wood stove glowed red-hot, but it was losing the battle against the penetrating cold. "We're going to my place," Marcus said, helping Mrs. Patterson gather medications. "Now." It took 20 minutes to get Harold to the Chen cabin, but within an hour of lying on Marcus's couch, the old man's color returned. His breathing steadied. His wife wept with relief. "How is it so warm in here?" she whispered. Marcus showed her the simple thermostat that controlled his geothermal system. "The earth wants to share its heat. You just have to know how to listen." That night, As the Pattersons slept safely in the guest room, Marcus stood at his window watching the storm rage. His phone showed 17 missed calls from neighbors he'd never spoken to, people who'd laughed at his tunnels just months ago. Tomorrow, he'd start digging again. Not for himself this time, but for Mrs. Patterson. For the Jenkins family whose propane had run out yesterday. For everyone who'd underestimated the mountain boy who talked to rocks. In his basement, the quiet hum of the circulation pump continued its steady rhythm, drawing warmth from the sleeping earth above. The storm arrived 3 days early, catching Millbrook with half its winter preparations incomplete. What began as gentle snowflakes at dawn had transformed into a howling blizzard by noon, with winds that rattled windows and sent ancient pine trees creaking ominously against the grey sky. From her kitchen window, Martha Henley watched her neighbor Harold struggle to secure a loose piece of siding that had torn free from his garage. The metal sheet flapped like a wounded bird, each gust threatening to send it sailing into someone's windshield. She pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders, already feeling the chill seeping through the glass. By evening, the temperature had plummeted to -15 degrees, and the real crisis began to unfold. Phone calls started filtering through the volunteer fire department's emergency line. Mrs. Peterson's ancient furnace had given up with a final wheeze. The Murphy family's oil delivery truck couldn't make it up their steep driveway, and the Hendersons' heat pump was struggling against the brutal cold. What had started as isolated incidents quickly revealed itself as something far more serious. At the emergency town meeting hastily convened in the community center, Mayor Davidson's usually steady voice carried an edge of barely controlled panic. The propane truck won't make it through until the roads are cleared, and that won't be for at least 3 days, maybe longer if this keeps up. He gestured toward the windows where snow was already piling against the glass. We've got 17 households without heat, and the shelter only has capacity for maybe half that number. Dr. Sarah Chen, who had moved to Millbrook just 6 months earlier to take over the retiring physician's practice, raised her hand. I'm already seeing signs of hypothermia in some of the elderly residents who've been brought in. If we can't get people warmed up soon. She didn't need to finish the sentence. Frank Morrison, who ran the hardware store, shook his head grimly. I've got space heaters, but not nearly enough. And even if I did, half the folks affected are in houses with electrical systems that can't handle the load. Start plugging in multiple units, and you're looking at fires or power outages. The room fell into an uneasy silence, broken only by the wind screaming around the building's corners. These were people accustomed to harsh winters, folks who prided themselves on preparation and self-reliance. But this storm had caught them off guard, exposing the fragile infrastructure that kept their mountain community livable. What about the Jensen place? The voice came from the back of the room. Tom Bradley, a local contractor, was frowning thoughtfully. I was up there a few weeks back fixing a section of his fence line. Kid's got some kind of setup that was keeping his whole house warm, and he wasn't burning wood or oil. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Most residents knew Elias Jensen by reputation rather than personal acquaintance, the quiet young man who'd inherited his grandfather's place and turned it into something that defied easy explanation. His rare appearances in town usually generated whispered conversations about strange contraptions and odd building projects. You sure about that? Frank asked. Because I know for a fact he hasn't bought heating oil from anyone in town, and I haven't seen any propane deliveries heading up that way. Dead sure, Tom replied. Place was warm as toast, and I didn't see a single radiator or baseboard heater. Asked him about it, but he just got that look he gets when people start asking too many questions. Martha Henley, who had known Elias since he was a boy visiting his grandfather during summers, cleared her throat. That child's always been different. Brilliant, mind you, but different. His grandfather used to say he could fix anything with spare parts and determination. She paused, remembering. Old Carl mentioned once that the boy was working on some kind of heating project, but I figured it was just another one of his tinkering experiments. Mayor Davidson looked around the room at the worried faces staring back at him. Outside, the storm showed no signs of abating, and the temperature was still dropping. Tom, you think you could make it up to the Jensen place? Maybe in your truck with the chains? Tom nodded slowly. Road's going to be rough, but yeah, I think I can get through. Question is whether he'll talk to us. Kid's not exactly what you'd call sociable. He'll talk, Martha said with quiet confidence. Elias might be standoffish, but he's not heartless. You tell him people are in trouble and he'll listen. As if summoned by their conversation, a section of siding on the community center chose that moment to tear loose with a screech of protesting metal. The sound sent a collective shiver through the room, a reminder of just how vulnerable they all were against the storm's fury. Dr. Chen checked her watch. We need to move fast. Every hour we wait, the situation gets more dangerous. The mayor made his decision. Tom, can you head up there now? Tom was already reaching for his coat. Give me 20 minutes to get the chains on. Then we'll see if young Jensen has any miracles hidden up on that mountain. The mercury hadn't climbed above 0 in 12 days. Maya pressed her nose against the frosted window of Hendrick's general store, watching her breath fog the glass as she peered through the gaps between desperate handwritten signs. Urgent, wood for elderly couple, will trade food for fuel, propane tanks, any size. Inside, the usual morning crowd had swelled to twice its size, but their voices carried an edge she'd never heard before. Mrs. Patterson clutched a jar of coins like a lifeline while arguing with Tom Hendricks about the price of kerosene. Old Pete sat hunched in the corner, his arthritic hands wrapped around a cup of coffee he was clearly making last as long as possible before returning to his unheated cabin. It's criminal, someone was saying. Highway's been closed 6 days now. When's the county gonna plow us out? County's got bigger problems than Pine Ridge, came the bitter reply. Heard on the radio they're calling it the worst storm system in 40 years. We're on our own. Maya pushed through the door, and the conversations died as heads turned her way. She'd grown used to the stares over the years, the mix of curiosity and barely concealed disdain that followed the strange girl who lived alone in the mountains. But today felt different. Today the looks carried something sharper. Well, well, drawled Jake Morrison from his perch near the pot-bellied stove that served as the store's only heat source. Look what the blizzard blew in. How's that crazy contraption of yours holding up, Maya? Still burning garbage to keep warm? A few people snickered, but Maya noticed others watching her with genuine interest. She'd been coming to town for supplies since she was 16, and in all that time, no one had ever asked about her heating system with anything approaching respect. It's holding up fine, she said evenly, pulling her shopping list from her pocket. The paper was warm to the touch, something that didn't go unnoticed by Jake, whose own fingers were blue with cold despite the crackling fire behind him. Fine? Mrs. Patterson spoke up from the counter, her voice sharp with disbelief. Child, people are burning furniture to stay alive. The Jenkins family moved in with the Roosevelts because their furnace died. How is anything fine right now? Maya studied the older woman's face, seeing past the skepticism to something else, a flicker of desperate hope. I've got heat, plenty of it. My house is warm enough that I'm still sleeping with the windows cracked. The store fell silent except for the pop and hiss of burning wood. Someone coughed. Outside, wind rattled the windows with a sound like bones. Bullshit, Jake said finally. Nobody's got heat like that, not unless you're sitting on a stockpile of propane you're not sharing. Maya turned to face him fully. I'm not using propane, or wood, or oil. Then what? The question came from Dr. Sarah Chen, who'd been quietly listening from the medicine aisle. As the town's only physician, she'd been making rounds on foot since the roads became impassable, checking on the elderly and vulnerable. Maya had seen her trudging through the snow at all hours, her medical bag clutched against her chest. Maya hesitated. She'd spent years perfecting her system, enduring the mockery and suspicion that came with being different. The smart thing would be to buy her supplies and leave, to retreat back to her warm house and let the town figure out its own problems. But Mrs. Patterson was counting coins for a quart of lamp oil that would last maybe 2 days. Pete's lips had a bluish tinge that had nothing to do with the coffee. And Dr. Chen looked like she hadn't slept in days, probably because she was too busy keeping other people alive to worry about her own comfort. Methane, Maya said quietly. I capture methane from organic waste and burn it for heat and electricity. Jake snorted. You mean you're burning garbage? Like I said, not burning it directly. Maya's voice grew stronger as she fell into explanation mode, the same tone she used when talking to herself while troubleshooting her equipment. Decomposing organic matter produces methane gas naturally. I've built a system that captures and concentrates it, then burns it cleanly. 1 pound of organic waste can produce enough gas to heat a room for hours. Dr. Chen stepped closer. The methane burns hot enough for space heating? Hot enough for anything. I run my whole house off it, plus a generator for electricity. Maya gestured toward the darkened corners of the store, where shadows gathered in the absence of working electric lights. And I process enough waste to keep the system running indefinitely. Indefinitely. Mrs. Patterson's coin counting had stopped entirely. Maya nodded. As long as there's organic waste to process, food scraps, paper, yard waste, anything that'll decompose. For the first time in years, the store was completely quiet when Maya spoke. No snickers, no eye rolls, no whispered comments about the crazy hermit girl, just the sound of desperate people doing math in their heads, calculating how much organic waste their town produced in a week, how much heat that might generate, how many lives it might save. The storm that had been threatening all week finally broke on Tuesday morning, descending on Pine Ridge with a fury that caught even the weather-hardened locals off guard. Maya watched from her kitchen window as snow fell so thick it erased the familiar landmarks of the valley, turning the world into a swirling white void. She'd spent the previous evening making final adjustments to her heating system, fine-tuning the airflow patterns and checking every joint in the underground network. The geothermal readings had been promising. The Earth's temperature remained constant, even as the surface world prepared to freeze. Now, as her cottage maintained a comfortable 72 degrees while the wind howled outside, she felt a quiet satisfaction. Her phone rang just after noon. Maya? It's Doc Hanson. His voice crackled through the static. We've got a situation developing. The power's been flickering all morning, and we just lost the main line into town. The backup generator at the clinic is running, but it won't last long in these conditions. Through the phone, she could hear the anxiety he was trying to keep out of his voice. How bad is it? Bad enough. Mrs. Chen's oxygen concentrator is on battery backup, and the Kowalski twins, you know they were born premature, they need to stay warm. Most folks have firewood, but if this keeps up, he paused. I'm making calls to anyone with alternative heating. Thought you might have some ideas. Maya looked out at the storm, then at her system's monitoring panel. The green lights blinked steadily, showing optimal performance across all zones. How many people are we talking about? The clinic's got 5 patients who can't be moved. The community center could house maybe 30 more if we had a way to heat it. The rest, well, they're hunkered down at home, but some of those older houses aren't well insulated. She closed her eyes, calculating. The network she'd built was designed for her cottage and greenhouse, but the principles were scalable. The community center sat on the same geological formation, and she'd noticed the old building had a partial basement that could serve as a distribution hub. Doc, I might have something. Give me 2 hours. Maya, what are you thinking? I'm thinking about keeping people alive. She hung up and immediately began pulling on her winter gear. The storm made the short trip to her workshop treacherous, but she needed the portable drilling equipment and the spare lengths of flexible ducting she'd stored there. The wind nearly knocked her off her feet twice, and by the time she reached the workshop, her face was numb despite her balaclava. Loading the equipment onto her modified snowmobile took another 20 minutes. The drilling unit was heavy, designed for the rocky soil that characterized their region, but it was her best hope for rapidly tapping into the geothermal resources beneath the community center. The ride into town was harrowing. The snow had already accumulated past her knees, and visibility was nearly zero. She navigated by memory and the occasional glimpse of power lines overhead, most of which now sagged dangerously under the weight of ice and snow. Pine Ridge's main street was deserted, except for a few emergency vehicles creeping along at walking speed. The community center sat dark and imposing, its Victorian architecture making it look like something from a ghost story. Maya pulled around to the back, where she knew the basement entrance would give her access to the building's foundation. The basement was exactly as she remembered from the town's emergency preparedness meetings. Concrete floor, stone foundation walls, and most importantly, minimal existing infrastructure to complicate her work. She set up the portable work lights she'd brought and began surveying the space. The geological maps she'd memorized indicated that the same underground thermal channel that fed her system passed roughly 30 feet below this location. It would be deeper than her home installation, requiring more powerful circulation, but the basic principles remained sound. By the time Doc Hansen arrived with 2 volunteers, Maya had already begun drilling the first exploratory hole. The sound of the drill echoed strangely in the empty basement, competing with the howl of wind above. "Maya, what exactly are you doing?" Doc asked, his breath visible in the cold air. "Building a heating system," she replied without stopping her work. "The earth below us is maintaining a constant 55 degrees. If I can tap into that and create circulation channels, we can warm this space without electricity." One of the volunteers, Jim Morrison from the hardware store, shook his head. "That's crazy talk. You can't heat a building this size with dirt." "Not dirt," Maya corrected, pulling the drill bit up to check her progress. "Thermal mass. The Earth stores heat energy from solar radiation and geological processes. I'm just borrowing some of it." The drill hit the thermal layer at 38 feet, and immediately she felt the subtle change in air temperature as warmer air began to rise from the hole. It was working. "I'll be damned," Jim muttered. Maya was already moving to mark the location for the second hole. The morning brought news that changed everything. Clara found Ezra hunched over his workbench, surrounded by metal scraps and copper tubing, his breath visible in the frigid air of his workshop. The town's power grid had failed completely during the night. "The transformer at the substation cracked," she announced, stamping snow from her boots. "Harold says it could be weeks before they get a replacement up here, especially with the road still impassable." Ezra didn't look up from the intricate coil he was shaping. "Weeks? The backup generators at the school are already running low on fuel. Mrs. Henderson's elderly mother nearly didn't wake up this morning. Hypothermia." Clara's voice carried an edge of desperation. "People are starting to talk about evacuating to the valley, but with this storm system—" "Evacuation's not possible," Ezra muttered, finally meeting her eyes. "I've been monitoring the weather patterns. This front's going to sit here for at least another week, maybe 2. Clara studied his face, seeing something she hadn't noticed before, calculation mixed with determination. "You have an idea, don't you?" Ezra set down his tools and walked to the window overlooking the town below. Smoke rose from a few chimneys, but many houses sat dark and cold. "My system here, it's not just heating my place. It's connected to something bigger." "What do you mean?" He led her outside, past the visible portions of his heating network, to a camouflaged metal access panel built into the hillside. Clara watched in amazement as he opened it, revealing a sophisticated control room carved directly into the mountain. Banks of monitoring equipment lined the walls, displaying temperature readings, pressure gauges, and flow rates from dozens of locations. "Ezra, what is this?" "I've been mapping the geothermal activity under the entire mountain for 5 years, he said, activating several screens. "There's a whole network of hot springs and thermal vents running under the town. Most people only know about the obvious ones, but there are dozens more." Clara stared at the displays showing a complex web of underground thermal sources. "You mean you could heat the whole town?" "Theoretically." He pulled up a detailed schematic of Millbrook's layout, overlaid with a geothermal map. "I've already drilled exploratory access points to 7 different thermal sources. The infrastructure's mostly in place. I just need to expand the distribution network." "How long would something like that take?" Ezra ran calculations on a worn calculator, cross-referencing with his charts. With help, 4 days to get basic heating to the school and medical clinic. Another week to reach most of the residential areas. Clara felt her pulse quicken. What kind of help? I need at least 12 people who can follow precise instructions for trenching and pipe installation. The work's dangerous. We'll be dealing with high-pressure systems and extremely hot water. One mistake could cause serious injuries. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. The same townspeople who had dismissed Ezra as eccentric would now need to trust him completely. Clara thought of the faces she'd seen that morning, children shivering despite multiple layers, elderly residents struggling with failing health, families burning furniture to stay warm. "I'll talk to Harold," she said. "He'll need to coordinate with the town council, but given the circumstances—" "Clara." Ezra's voice stopped her at the door. "There's something else you should know. The reason I've been so secretive about all this." She turned back, noting the tension in his posture. 3 years ago, I approached the council with a preliminary proposal for a town-wide geothermal system. They laughed me out of the meeting, called it a waste of taxpayer money, said I was trying to turn Millbrook into some kind of science experiment. Clara felt pieces clicking into place. "So, you've been building this on your own? Every component, every connection. I've been preparing for exactly this scenario." He gestured toward the monitoring equipment. "I knew eventually there'd be a winter bad enough that conventional heating wouldn't be sufficient." The weight of his words settled between them. Ezra hadn't just been the town eccentric tinkering in his workshop. He'd been methodically constructing a backup system for an entire community that had rejected his help. "They're going to feel pretty foolish," Clara observed. "I don't care about that." Ezra's expression hardened. "But I do care about whether they'll trust me now. If we're going to make this work, there's no room for second-guessing or committee decisions. When I say dig, they dig. When I say stop, they stop. People's lives are going to depend on precision." Clara nodded, understanding the magnitude of what he was proposing. "I'll make sure they understand." As she prepared to leave, Ezra called out one final instruction. "Tell Harold to bring anyone who's worked construction, plumbing, or electrical. And Clara, we start this afternoon. Every hour we wait means someone else might not make it through another night." The storm's fury had escalated beyond anything the valley had seen in living memory. Gus peered through the frost-covered window of his workshop, watching the snow pile against the buildings in town like nature's own barricade. The wind howled with a voice that seemed almost alive, and he could barely make out the dim glow of emergency lights flickering in the distance. His heating system hummed steadily behind him, the intricate network of pipes and chambers working in perfect harmony. The workshop remained comfortably warm despite the chaos outside, but Gus's mind wasn't on his own comfort. Through the blizzard, he'd caught glimpses of people moving between buildings, their forms bent against the wind as they struggled through snowdrifts that reached past their waists. The radio on his workbench crackled with static before Mayor Patricia Henley's voice cut through the interference. "This is an emergency broadcast. All residents are advised to conserve fuel and battery power. The storm has knocked out power lines to the Eastern District, and road crews cannot reach us until conditions improve." Gus turned the volume up, his weathered hands pausing over a half-assembled component he'd been tinkering with. The mayor's voice carried an edge of concern that she was trying to mask. "Community warming centers have been established at the town hall and the old mining office. If you're experiencing heating difficulties, please make your way to these locations when it's safe to do so." He knew what that really meant. People were running out of fuel. The propane deliveries that should have arrived last week were stranded somewhere on the mountain highway, and the electrical grid was failing under the weight of ice-laden power lines. In a town where winter survival depended on staying warm, this storm was becoming a genuine crisis. Gus walked to his supply shed, taking inventory of the materials he'd accumulated over the years. Copper pipes, old radiators, salvaged fans, and dozens of other components that most people would consider junk. But looking at them now, He saw possibilities. His mind began working through calculations, visualizing how his heating design could be scaled up, modified, distributed. The problem wasn't just heat, it was distribution. His system worked beautifully for his workshop and the small cabin he called home, but the town needed something bigger, something that could warm multiple buildings simultaneously. He thought about the old steam tunnels that ran beneath Main Street, relics from the mining days when underground pipes carried heat to company buildings. Those tunnels were still there, mostly forgotten but structurally sound. If he could tap into them, create a central heating source that fed through the existing underground network, he might be able to warm half the town. It would require modifications to his design, additional heat exchangers, and a much larger combustion chamber. But first, he needed to get down there and see what he was working with. Gus bundled himself in his heaviest coat and stepped out into the storm. The cold hit him like a physical blow, and the wind immediately tried to knock him off balance. He lowered his head and pushed forward, following the familiar path toward town, even though he could barely see 5 feet ahead. The snow crunched under his boots as he made his way to the old maintenance access behind the hardware store. The metal cover was nearly buried, but he dug it out with gloved hands, his breath forming clouds that were immediately torn away by the wind. The ladder down into the tunnel was slick with ice, but it held his weight as he descended into darkness. His flashlight beam revealed a narrow, brick-lined passage that stretched into shadows. The air was warmer down here, insulated from the storm's bite, and he could see his breath more clearly. Old iron pipes ran along the walls, some still intact, others corroded beyond use, but the infrastructure was there, waiting. He followed the main tunnel toward the center of town, his footsteps echoing in the confined space. At several points, smaller passages branched off toward different buildings. The town hall, the general store, the diner, all connected by this forgotten network that had once kept the mining settlement warm through brutal winters just like this one. When Gus emerged through another access point near the town hall, he could hear voices inside the building. Through the frosted windows, he saw the warm glow of emergency lighting and the silhouettes of families huddled together. Children's voices mixed with the worried murmurs of adults discussing fuel ratios and how long their supplies might last. He stood in the storm for a moment, snow collecting on his shoulders as he looked up at the building. These were his neighbors, people who'd known him for years, even if they didn't quite understand him. Some had been kind, others had whispered about the eccentric hermit who lived up the mountain with his strange contraptions. But tonight, none of that mattered. Tonight, his peculiar expertise might be the only thing standing between his community and disaster. Gus pulled his coat tighter and headed back toward the tunnel entrance. He had work to do. The emergency meeting convened at dawn in the town hall, the building's windows frosted over like blind eyes. Mayor Hendricks sat at the head of a long table that wobbled under the weight of worry and desperation. Around him, the town council huddled in their heaviest coats, breath visible in the frigid air despite the struggling furnace below. "We've lost 3 more furnaces overnight," reported Jim Crawford, the fire chief. His weathered face bore the exhaustion of a man who'd been fighting a losing battle. The Pattersons, the Kowalskis, and the elementary school's main heating unit. That's 17 families without heat, plus we can't open the school tomorrow. Council member Sarah Chen pulled her scarf tighter. "The shelter at the community center is overcrowded. We're housing 43 people in a space meant for 20. It's not sustainable." Through the frosted windows, the wind howled like something alive and hungry. The storm had been relentless for 6 days, and the temperature hadn't climbed above -15 in 72 hours. The county road crews had given up trying to clear the mountain pass after losing 2 plows to drifts that reached the telephone wires. What about Kai Morrison's place? The question came from Dr. Patricia Voss, the town's physician, who'd spent the last 3 days treating cases of mild hypothermia and checking on elderly residents. "I drove past yesterday during my rounds, smoke from his chimney, but his house was, I don't know how to describe it, warm. The snow had melted off his entire roof." Mayor Hendricks shifted uncomfortably. "Doc, we all know Kai's different. Whatever he's got up there, it's probably some jerry-rigged contraption that'll burn the mountain down. Will it keep people from freezing to death? Dr. Voss's voice cut through the diplomatic niceties. Because I've got Mrs. Henderson sleeping in my office because her apartment's furnace died. And yesterday I treated Tommy Chen for mild frostbite because Sarah's backup heater couldn't handle the cold. Sarah Chen nodded grimly. Patricia's right. Whatever reservations we have about Kai, we need to at least investigate. Pride won't keep us warm. Fire Chief Crawford leaned forward. I've been up to his place a few times over the years. Code inspections, welfare checks when neighbors worried. That kid's smart. Smarter than any of us gave him credit for. Unconventional, yes. Dangerous, I'm not so sure. The mayor rubbed his temples. 3 weeks ago, Kai Morrison had been the town's eccentric hermit, the strange young man who lived alone in his grandfather's cabin, and built incomprehensible contraptions from scavenged materials. Now, with the worst winter storm in recorded history holding the entire valley hostage, his warm house had become the subject of desperate speculation. "All right," Hendricks said finally. "Jim, can you get up there? Take a look at whatever he's running? If it's safe, maybe we can replicate it or at least understand how he's managing." "I'll go with him," volunteered Tom Bradley, the town's only electrician. "If it involves any kind of electrical work, I should see it." Dr. Voss stood. "I'm coming too. If we're potentially looking at relocating people, I need to assess the space and safety conditions. Plus, Kai trusts me more than most folks in town." That was true. While others had dismissed Kai as odd or troublesome, Dr. Voss had always treated him with professional courtesy during his infrequent visits to town. She'd been one of the few people who hadn't whispered about his mental state after his grandfather's death 3 years ago. Council member Robert Hayes, who'd remained silent until now, finally spoke. "What if he says no? What if he doesn't want to help? We can't force him." The room fell quiet, except for the wind rattling the windows. It was a valid concern. Kai had good reason to be wary of the town's sudden interest in his affairs. For years, people had crossed the street to avoid him, whispered about his strange projects, and generally treated him like an unwelcome oddity. "We ask nicely," Dr. Voss said simply. "We explain the situation, we apologize for how he's been treated, and we ask for help. Kai's not cruel. He's just protective of himself. Can't say I blame him." Mayor Hendricks looked around the table. Every face reflected the same desperate calculation. How much pride could they afford when lives were at stake? Outside, the storm continued its assault, indifferent to their human struggles and municipal politics. "Fine. Jim, Tom, Doc, head up there as soon as the wind dies down enough to make the drive safely. Find out what he's got, how it works, and whether it can help us. And for God's sake, be respectful. We need him more than he needs us." As if summoned by his words, a powerful gust shook the entire building, rattling windows and doors. Somewhere in the walls, pipes creaked ominously, and the struggling furnace wheezed like an old man climbing stairs. Time was running out, and their salvation might rest with the very person they'd spent years dismissing as the town's harmless madman. The knock on Ezra's door came at dawn, urgent and insistent. He found Mayor Collins standing in the whipping snow, flanked by 3 council members who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. Their faces were grim, carved from the same grey stone as the morning sky. "We need to talk," Collins said without preamble. Ezra stepped aside, letting them into his workshop. The warmth hit them immediately, a wall of blessed heat that made their cheeks flush and their shoulders relax despite themselves. Collins's eyes swept the room, taking in the maze of copper tubing, the gentle hum of machinery, the impossible fact that this ramshackle place was warmer than any building in town. 43 people came to the emergency shelter last night, Collins began. The Hendersons' pipes burst. The Yamamoto family's furnace gave out completely. Mrs. Chen's 90-year-old mother is showing signs of hypothermia. He paused, his breath still visible even in Ezra's warm workshop. "We're looking at a real crisis here." Councilman Pierce stepped forward, his usual skepticism replaced by something that looked almost like desperation. The state won't be able to get emergency heating supplies to us for at least a week, maybe more, depending on this storm. Ezra listened without speaking, his hands absently adjusting a valve on one of his copper assemblies. He'd known this was coming, had felt it in the way people's eyes lingered on his house during their trips to the shelter, in the whispered conversations that died when he approached. "What exactly are you asking?" he said finally. "We need you to share whatever this is," Collins gestured around the room. "Your heating system, your method, we need it for the whole town." The silence stretched between them, filled only by the quiet operation of Ezra's mysterious machinery. Through the workshop windows they could see the snow continuing to fall, relentless and thick. "You think I can just snap my fingers and heat the entire town?" Ezra's voice carried an edge of something, not quite anger but close. "We think you're the only one who might be able to figure out how," said Councilwoman Martinez. "Look, we know we haven't exactly been supportive of your work, but people are going to die if we don't do something." Ezra moved to a workbench covered in diagrams and calculations. His fingers traced over sketches that none of them could interpret, geometric patterns that seemed to flow like water, mathematical equations that hurt to look at directly. "Even if I could scale this up," he said slowly, "it would require materials we don't have, precise measurements, understanding of principles that took me years to work out." "Then teach us," Pierce said. "Start with something simple, one building at a time." "Simple." Ezra laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You want simple? I've been working on this for 8 years. 8 years of people calling me crazy, telling me I'm wasting my time, crossing the street to avoid talking to me. And now it's simple?" Collins stepped forward, his diplomatic mask slipping. "People are scared, Ezra. Genuinely scared. Whatever we've done wrong, whatever we've said, we're asking for help. Not for us, but for families who won't make it through another week of this." Something in the mayor's tone seemed to reach Ezra. He stopped pacing, stopped fidgeting with his equipment. For a long moment, he stared out the window at the town below, barely visible through the curtain of falling snow. "There's a way," he said finally. "Not to heat everything, but to create warm zones, safe spaces." He turned back to them, his eyes brighter than they'd seen before. "The community center, the school, maybe 1 or 2 other large buildings. I could modify their existing systems, integrate them with a network that shares the thermal load." "How long would that take?" Martinez asked. "Working alone? Impossible. But if I had help..." Ezra's mind was already racing ahead, calculating possibilities. "I'd need people who can follow instructions precisely, no improvisation, no shortcuts, and I'd need access to materials, copper piping, specific types of stone, tools for precision work." "Whatever you need," Collins said immediately. "And I'd need people to stop treating this like some kind of folk magic," Ezra continued, his voice gaining strength. "This is engineering. Thermodynamics. It follows rules, even if those rules aren't the ones you're used to." Pierce nodded slowly. "How many lives could we save? If it works? If people are willing to relocate to the heated zones temporarily?" Ezra considered. "Most of them. Maybe all of them." The room fell quiet again as the weight of the moment settled over them. Outside, the storm showed no signs of abating. But inside Ezra's workshop, something had shifted. The walls that had stood between the town and its strangest resident were finally beginning to crack. "When do we start?" Collins asked. Ezra was already reaching for his coat. The town council meeting had devolved into chaos by the time Ezra slipped through the back door of the community center. Voices rose and fell in heated argument, punctuated by the occasional slam of Mayor Patterson's gavel demanding order. The emergency session had been called after 3 more families had been evacuated from homes where pipes had burst and heating systems failed completely. "We can't keep pretending this isn't a crisis," Dr. Sarah Chen was saying from the front row, her usually composed voice strained. "I've treated 4 cases of hypothermia in the past week alone. Mrs. Henderson nearly didn't make it." Ezra pressed himself against the wall, pulling his wool cap low over his eyes. He'd only come to listen, to understand what the town was planning. The strange looks and whispered conversations that followed him through the grocery store had made it clear that word of his heating system was spreading, though he wasn't sure how much people actually knew. "The county says they can't get emergency heating supplies up here for at least another week," Councilman Burke reported grimly. "The main road is still blocked, and they're prioritizing larger population centers." "What about the Hartley place?" The voice came from somewhere in the middle of the packed room. Ezra couldn't see who had spoken, but he felt his stomach tighten. "My cousin lives up that way, says they've got heat somehow." Mayor Patterson shifted uncomfortably. "We've heard reports about some kind of alternative heating arrangement, but until we know more about the safety and feasibility—" "Safety?" The interruption came from Tom Garrett, whose face was red with either cold or anger. "My kids are sleeping in sleeping bags in our living room because it's the only warm room left in our house. Don't talk to me about safety when people are freezing." Dr. Chen stood again. "I've been thinking about what we saw at the Hartley place. The engineering principles, while unconventional, appeared sound. The thermal distribution was remarkable." "Appeared sound to who?" Councilman Morrison's skeptical voice cut through the murmur that had started. "We're talking about the same Ezra Hartley who tried to build a perpetual motion machine out of bicycle parts when he was 16, who thinks he can predict weather patterns by watching his cats." "His cats were right about this storm," someone called out, earning nervous laughter from parts of the crowd. Ezra felt heat rise in his cheeks despite the cold. He'd grown used to being the town's eccentric, the subject of bemused tolerance at best. But hearing his life's work dismissed so casually stung more than he'd expected. "The question isn't whether Ezra is conventional," Dr. Chen continued, her voice gaining strength. "The question is whether his solution works, and from what I observed, it does. Brilliantly. Even if it works for one house," Mayor Patterson said, attempting to regain control, "we can't possibly replicate something that complex across the entire town in the middle of a blizzard." "Why not?" The voice was quiet, but somehow carried through the entire room. Ezra realized with horror that he'd spoken aloud. Every head turned toward the back of the room, and he found himself the focus of dozens of pairs of eyes. "I mean," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper, "why does it have to be complex?" Mayor Patterson gestured for him to come forward. On unsteady legs, Ezra made his way to the front of the room, feeling the weight of the town's attention like a physical force. "The system at my place took years to build," he said, addressing his words to the floor rather than the faces watching him. "But the principle is simple. Heat rises. Water conducts, thermal mass stores. We're not lacking the materials, we're just not thinking about how to use them differently." Dr. Chen leaned forward. "What are you suggesting?" Ezra's mind raced, seeing connections and possibilities that had been forming subconsciously since he'd first heard about the town's crisis. The old mining tunnels. They run under half the town, and they maintain a constant temperature year-round. If we could tap into that thermal mass, create a distribution network. "That's impossible," Councilman Morrison interrupted. "Those tunnels were sealed decades ago for safety reasons." "Sealed but not filled," Ezra replied, finally looking up. "And I know where every entrance is. My grandfather's maps, his mining records, they're all still in the attic." The room had grown quiet except for the wind howling outside. Ezra could see the calculation happening in people's faces, weighing their desperation against their doubts about him. "Even if we could access the tunnels," Mayor Patterson said slowly, "we'd need someone who understands thermal dynamics, engineering principles. We'd need someone who thinks differently," Dr. Chen added, her eyes fixed on Ezra. "Someone who sees solutions where others see problems." Ezra felt something shift in the room's atmosphere. The skeptical murmurs were being replaced by something else, tentative hope, perhaps, or maybe just the recognition that conventional thinking had already failed them. The storm that had been building for 3 days, finally broke with a vengeance that made the previous blizzards seem like gentle snow flurries. Maya pressed her face against the workshop window, watching as the wind turned snowflakes into horizontal bullets of ice. The thermometer outside read -38 degrees and still dropping. "The pipes in the Henderson house froze solid this morning," Thomas said, stamping snow off his boots as he entered. His face was grim beneath the frost coating his beard. "That's the 4th house this week. People are talking about evacuating to the valley." Maya turned from the window, her mind already racing through calculations. The geothermal system was working perfectly for the dozen homes now connected, but expanding it further would take weeks they didn't have. The storm was too severe, the cold too intense for traditional heating to cope. "There's something else," Thomas continued, pulling out a worn leather journal. "I found this in my grandfather's things after you mentioned the old stories." He kept detailed records of the winter of 1887. Maya took the journal with reverent hands. The pages were yellowed and brittle, filled with meticulous handwriting that documented temperatures, wind patterns, and something else that made her heart race. "Look at page 47, Thomas said quietly. Maya flipped to the page and gasped. There, sketched in fading ink, was a diagram that looked remarkably similar to her geothermal design. But this version showed something more, a network of underground chambers that her modern equipment had somehow missed. "Your great-grandfather knew about the thermal vents," she whispered, tracing the drawings with her finger. "But he found something bigger. Look at these measurements." The journal described a vast underground cavern system, heated by multiple geothermal sources. According to the notes, the caverns could provide enough heat for the entire town, but accessing them required precise drilling through unstable rock formations. "He tried to convince people to let him dig," Thomas explained, "but they thought he was crazy." "Sound familiar?" A violent gust of wind shook the building and the lights flickered. Maya looked up to see Mrs. Patterson stumbling through the storm toward the workshop, her coat whipping around her like a sail. "Emergency at the school," she gasped as Thomas helped her inside. The heating system failed completely. "We've got 32 children trapped there until the storm passes, and the backup generators won't last the night." Maya felt ice form in her stomach. The school was on the opposite side of town from her current geothermal network. Running new pipes through the storm would be impossible, and the building was too old and too large for any quick heating solutions. She stared at the journal again, studying her ancestors' careful calculations. The main thermal cavern he'd discovered was almost directly beneath the school. If his measurements were correct, a single well could tap into enough heat to warm the entire building. "I need to get to the school," Maya said, already pulling on her heavy coat. "Are you insane?" Mrs. Patterson protested. "The visibility is zero, and the wind is strong enough to blow a person off their feet." "The children will freeze without heat," Maya replied, stuffing the journal into her pack along with her drilling equipment. "According to these notes, there's a geothermal source right under the school. I just need to find the exact spot and drill down to it." Thomas grabbed her arm. "Maya, that journal is over a century old. What if the measurements are wrong? What if the cavern collapsed? You could be risking your life for nothing." She met his eyes steadily. "And what if I'm right? What if this storm is exactly like the one your great-grandfather faced? What if this is why he left those notes? So that someday someone would be crazy enough to try?" The wind howled again, and the workshop lights went out completely. In the darkness, Maya heard Mrs. Patterson's sharp intake of breath. "The power grid just failed," Thomas said grimly. "That means every house in town just lost electric heat." Maya shouldered her pack and picked up her portable drilling rig. "Then it's not just about the children anymore. It's about everyone." She headed for the door, but Thomas blocked her path. For a moment she thought he would try to stop her. Instead, he grabbed his own coat and the emergency radio. "If you're going out in this storm, you're not going alone," he said firmly. "Besides, someone needs to help you interpret that journal. My great-grandfather's handwriting was terrible." Mrs. Patterson watched them prepare to venture into the blizzard. "You're both completely mad," she said softly. Then she picked up her own coat. The school has emergency supplies and a backup communication system. If you're really going to try this, you'll need coordination from inside the building. Maya felt a surge of gratitude and terror. Outside, the storm raged with primordial fury, and somewhere beneath their feet lay either salvation or disaster. The line between genius and madness had never felt thinner. The morning after the avalanche brought a silence that felt heavier than the snow itself. Maya stood at her workshop window, watching the search teams emerge from the community center like ants from a disturbed hill. The storm had finally broken, leaving behind a crystalline world that sparkled with deceptive beauty. Her heating system hummed steadily behind her, the improvised network of pipes and thermal collectors working at full capacity to keep the shelter warm. But the fuel situation had become critical. The avalanche had buried their main supply depot under 20 feet of snow and debris, and what remained wouldn't last another week. Maya. Dr. Henderson's voice carried exhaustion as he approached from behind. The search teams found something. She turned, noting the grim set of his weathered features. Bodies? No, that's the strange part. They found equipment, government equipment, monitoring devices, weather stations, communication gear. All of it buried in what should have been undisturbed forest. Maya felt her blood chill in a way that had nothing to do with the mountain air. How long has it been there? Hard to say. Some of it looks recent, but other pieces... Henderson shook his head. Other pieces have been there for years, maybe decades. The implications hit her like a physical blow. Government monitoring stations didn't just appear randomly in remote mountain valleys. Someone had been watching this place, studying it for far longer than anyone realized. The question was why? There's more, Henderson continued, his voice dropping lower. Thomas Chen has been asking questions about your father's research, specific questions about thermal dynamics and geological surveys from 20 years ago. Maya's hands clenched into fists. She'd known Chen was hiding something, but this confirmation felt like ice water in her veins. Her father's work had always been theoretical, academic, or so she'd believed. But if the government had been monitoring their valley for decades, if they'd known about the geothermal potential all along, where is Chen now? She asked. That's the problem. Nobody's seen him since yesterday evening. His gear is still in the shelter, but he's gone. Maya grabbed her coat and headed for the door. Henderson caught her arm. Where are you going? It's still dangerous out there. The snow's unstable, and we've got another storm system moving in. I'm going to check something. She pulled free of his grip. Keep the heating system running. Don't let anyone touch the main controls. The trek to her father's old research site took twice as long as usual, the fresh snow making every step treacherous. But Maya knew these mountains like most people knew their own homes, and muscle memory guided her through the transformed landscape. The site itself was barely recognizable. What had once been a small clearing dotted with her father's modest equipment was now a crater of disturbed earth and snow. Someone had been digging recently. Maya followed the excavation marks, her heart pounding as the scope of the disturbance became clear. This wasn't random exploration. Whoever had done this knew exactly what they were looking for. At the deepest point of the dig, she found traces of her father's original thermal monitoring equipment. Pieces she'd assumed had been lost to time and weather. But they hadn't been lost. They'd been buried, deliberately. Fascinating work, your father's research. Maya spun around to find Thomas Chen emerging from the tree line, his government-issued winter gear pristine despite the conditions. In his hands, he carried a device she didn't recognize, some kind of scanner or detector. You knew, she said, her voice steady despite the fury building in her chest. You've known about the geothermal potential all along. Chen smiled, but it held no warmth. We've known about a lot of things, Maya. The question is what we do with that knowledge. The monitoring stations, the avalanche timing, even the severity of this storm system, you've been tracking all of it. The pieces clicked together in her mind with horrible clarity. This whole crisis, it's been orchestrated. Not orchestrated, anticipated. Chen stepped closer, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "Your father discovered something 20 years ago that could revolutionize energy production. But he was too idealistic, too concerned with environmental impact and community consent. Some discoveries are too important for individual conscience." Maya felt the ground shift beneath her feet, and not from snow instability. Her father hadn't been just a researcher, he'd been a whistleblower, someone who'd tried to protect this valley from exploitation. "The heating system," she whispered. "You're not here to help with the crisis, you're here to steal the technology. I'm here to ensure it reaches its full potential. Your improvised network has proven the concept works on a larger scale. Now we can implement it properly." Maya's mind raced. The people in the shelter depending on her system for survival, her father's legacy built on principles of community and sustainability, and this man representing forces that would strip mine those principles for profit and power. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of incoming snow. Another storm was building, and this conversation was about to become a battle for everything she'd ever believed in. The emergency council meeting convened at dawn in the town hall, its windows fogged with condensation from too many worried breaths in the frigid air. Mayor Hendricks sat at the head of the worn oak table, his face etched with exhaustion. The thermometer outside had plummeted to -18 degrees overnight, and the weather service predicted another week of the same brutal conditions. "We've lost 3 more families to hypothermia scares," Dr. Martinez reported, her voice hoarse from working through the night. "The Pattersons had to abandon their house entirely when their pipes burst and froze the floors solid. They're staying at the community center now, but we're running out of space and blankets." Tom Brennan, the hardware store owner, shook his head grimly. "I've got maybe 2 days of firewood left, and that's being generous. The delivery trucks can't make it up the mountain roads. We're completely cut off." Through the frosted window, they could see smoke rising steadily from Ezra's property on the ridge. While the rest of Millbrook struggled against the killing cold, that mysterious column of warmth continued its gentle ascent into the grey sky, a mocking reminder of the boy they'd dismissed for so long. "Someone needs to swallow their pride and talk to him," Sarah Chen said quietly. As the town's newest resident, she'd observed the situation with clearer eyes than most. Whatever he's built up there, it's working. The room fell silent except for the creaking of frozen wood and the distant howl of wind through the eaves. Everyone knew she was right, but admitting it meant confronting years of mockery and neglect. "I'll go," volunteered Jim Patterson, though his voice lacked conviction. "I mean, someone should check on him anyway. Make sure he's alive up there." "We all know he's alive," Dr. Martinez said sharply. "The question is whether he'll help us after how we've treated him." Mayor Hendricks stood slowly, his joints protesting in the cold. "I'll go myself. This is my responsibility." The trek up to Ezra's cabin proved treacherous. The snow had drifted to waist-deep in places, and the wind cut through their winter gear like knives. But as they climbed higher, something remarkable happened. The air began to warm. By the time they reached the clearing where Ezra's modest cabin sat, they were surrounded by an envelope of comfortable heat. Snow melted in perfect circles around strange metal sculptures that jutted from the ground at seemingly random intervals. Steam rose from pools of water that should have been solid ice. Ezra emerged from his workshop before they could knock, as if he'd sensed their approach. He looked older somehow, his wild hair now streaked with premature grey, his eyes holding a weight that hadn't been there before the winter began. "Mayor," he said simply, no surprise in his voice. "Dr. Martinez." "Mr. Patterson." "Ezra," the mayor began, then stopped, struggling with words that seemed inadequate. That is, the town." "You need help," Ezra finished, not unkindly. Dr. Martinez stepped forward. "3 families lost their homes to the cold last night. We've got children at risk. Whatever you've built here, it's keeping you warm while the rest of us freeze." Ezra nodded slowly, his gaze drifting to the metal structures scattered around his property. "Geothermal collection arrays," he said. "Took me 4 years to map the thermal vents running under this ridge. Most people thought I was just digging random holes. Can it be expanded? Mayor Hendricks asked, hope creeping into his voice. Already has been, Ezra replied, surprising them. The main collection point is here, but I've been running distribution lines down the mountain for months. They terminate about 50 yards from the town's water main. Jim Patterson stared at him. You mean you've already connected? No. I needed the town's permission to tie into your infrastructure. Didn't think that was forthcoming. There was no bitterness in Ezra's voice, just simple fact. The three visitors exchanged glances. While they'd been dismissing him as the village eccentric, Ezra had been quietly engineering their salvation. What would you need from us? Dr. Martinez asked. Access to the pump house and the old steam tunnels under Main Street. They were sealed up in the 60s when the town switched to electric heating, but they're still intact. My system can push heated water through those channels and warm most of the downtown buildings. How long would that take? The mayor pressed. If I had help? 12 hours, maybe less. The hard work is already done. As if summoned by their conversation, more figures appeared at the edge of the clearing. Sarah Chen led a group of townspeople, all bundled against the cold, all drawn by the same desperate hope. Ezra, Sarah called out, her breath forming clouds in the warm air surrounding his property. We came to ask for your help, all of us. The young inventor looked at the growing crowd of neighbors who'd spent years viewing him as an oddity. His expression remained unreadable, but something shifted in his eyes, not forgiveness exactly, but perhaps understanding. Well then, he said quietly, we'd better get started. The accusations began at dawn, whispered through frost-covered windows and passed along bread lines like contaminated water. By noon, they had crystallized into something far more dangerous than mere gossip. It's too convenient, Martha Henley declared, her voice carrying across the town hall where nearly 200 people had gathered despite the bitter cold. A freak storm appears overnight, and suddenly Ezra's the hero? What if he caused this whole mess to begin with? Murmurs rippled through the crowd like wind through wheat. Sarah felt her stomach clench as she watched faces she'd known since childhood transform with suspicion. The same people who'd gratefully accepted warmth from Ezra's geothermal system now eyed it with newfound fear. That's ridiculous. Dr. Martinez stood, his medical authority lending weight to his words. Weather patterns don't work that way. You can't just conjure a storm. Can't you? This from Bill Torino, the hardware store owner whose business had suffered since people stopped buying traditional heating supplies. We don't know what that boy's been doing up there all these years. All that digging, those strange contraptions. What if he's been messing with things he shouldn't? Sarah caught sight of Ezra near the back of the hall, his face pale but determined. He'd insisted on attending despite her warnings, and now she watched him absorb each accusation like physical blows. The timing is suspicious, added another voice. This storm hit right after his system went fully operational, right after he became the town's savior. So you're suggesting what exactly? Mayor Peck's voice cut through the babble, sharp with exhaustion. The past weeks had aged him visibly, dark circles shadowing his eyes. That Ezra somehow controls the weather? That he's some kind of... He paused, seeming to realize the absurdity of what he was about to say. Witch, someone whispered from the crowd. The word hung in the air like a curse itself. In the 21st century, in a town that prided itself on pragmatism, the accusation should have been laughable. But fear had a way of dragging people backward through centuries of progress. I've seen the calculations, Professor Williams said, rising slowly from his seat. His cane tapped against the wooden floor as he moved forward. Ezra's work is based on sound geological principles. There's nothing supernatural about geothermal energy. But what about the rest of it? Martha pressed. The way he knew exactly where to dig? The way his system works better than anything the experts said was possible? It's not natural. Neither is flying, Williams replied dryly. Neither are cell phones or satellite television. Unusual doesn't mean evil. Sarah watched Ezra's face carefully. She knew him well enough now to read the signs, the slight tremor in his hands, the way his breathing had become shallow and rapid. He was fighting something, some internal battle that went deeper than mere hurt feelings. "I need to speak," Ezra said quietly, but the words carried in the sudden hush that fell over the crowd. "Son, you don't have to," Mayor Peck began. "Yes, I do." Ezra stepped forward, his voice growing stronger. "You want to know why I knew where to dig? Why my system works so well? Because I've been studying this mountain my entire life. Every rock formation, every thermal signature, every geological quirk. Not because I have some mystical power, but because I had nothing else." The crowd shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't what they'd expected. Not defiance, but raw honesty. "You all had each other," Ezra continued, his eyes sweeping the room. "You had community, friendship, belonging. I had rocks and mathematics and the feeling that if I could just understand this place well enough, maybe I could find a way to be useful to it. To you." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes as understanding dawned. All those years of isolation hadn't been about antisocial tendencies or family dysfunction. They'd been about a lonely boy trying to earn his place in a world that had never quite made room for him. "The storm isn't my fault," Ezra said simply, "but the solution is. Every calculation, every innovation, every breakthrough that's keeping us alive right now, I did that. Not through magic or manipulation, but through work. Years and years of work that most of you never saw because you never bothered to look." The accusatory murmurs had died away, replaced by an uncomfortable silence. Martha Henley's face had flushed red, though whether from shame or continued anger, Sarah couldn't tell. "So you can believe I'm some kind of weather-controlling mastermind if it makes you feel better," Ezra concluded. "Or you can accept that sometimes the weird kid who doesn't fit in might actually know something valuable. Either way, my system keeps working and you keep living through this winter." He turned and walked toward the exit, leaving behind a room full of people suddenly forced to confront the difference between salvation and convenience, between gratitude and ownership, between genius and the comfortable fiction that extraordinary things must come from extraordinary people rather than extraordinary effort. The storm had been raging for 3 days when the first bodies were discovered. Maya pressed her face against the frosted window of the community center, watching as Doc Brennan's team carried stretchers through the blinding snow. The elderly Hendersons from Maple Street hadn't made it through the night. Their house had been one of the last holdouts, refusing Maya's heating system installation until it was too late. "How many more?" she whispered to Thomas, who stood behind her with his hand on her shoulder. "Brennan thinks maybe a dozen families are still unreachable," he said quietly. "The snow's too deep now for the rescue teams to get through to the outer neighborhoods." Maya turned away from the window, her jaw set with determination. "Then we go to them." "Maya, no." Sheriff Coleman approached from across the room, shaking snow from his coat. "I just came back from trying to reach the Morrison place. The drifts are 12 feet high in some spots. We lost radio contact with 2 of my deputies an hour ago." But Maya was already pulling on her heaviest coat, her mind racing through calculations, the wind patterns, the thermal dynamics, the way her heating system could be modified for emergency deployment. She'd been thinking about this possibility since the storm began, a mobile version that could create temporary heat zones. "What if we don't have to reach them?" she said, turning to face the room full of worried townspeople. "What if we can bring the heat to them?" The room fell silent except for the howling wind outside. Maya walked to the center of the space, where someone had spread a map of Millbrook across a folding table. She pointed to the isolated houses marked in red, the ones they couldn't reach. "The storm's moving in a predictable pattern," she explained, tracing the wind direction with her finger. "If we can create a series of heat amplification points along these ridgelines, we can redirect warm air currents down into the valleys where people are trapped." Doc Brennan frowned. "Maya, how would you even—" "Controlled thermal explosions," Maya interrupted, her voice gaining confidence as the plan crystallized in her mind. "Small charges placed at specific elevation points, timed to create updrafts that pull warm air from my main heating network and push it down through the snow cover." The silence stretched longer this time. Mayor Thompson rubbed his temples while several townspeople exchanged the familiar looks, the ones Maya had grown up seeing whenever she shared her ideas. "That's insane," Coleman said finally. "You're talking about setting off explosives in the middle of a blizzard." "I'm talking about physics," Maya shot back. "Heat transfer, pressure differentials, fluid dynamics. The storm is just another system, and every system can be influenced if you understand its variables." Thomas stepped forward, studying the map. "What would you need?" "Thomas, you can't be serious," his father began. "She's saved this town once already," Thomas said firmly. "Maybe we should listen before we dismiss it." Maya felt a surge of gratitude toward him, but she forced herself to focus on the technical requirements. "I'd need access to the road maintenance explosives, about 6 portable heat generators, and a way to get to these 3 points." She marked the map with quick X's. "The timing has to be perfect, and someone would need to monitor the thermal readings while I set the charges." "You're not going out there alone," Thomas said immediately. "No." Maya looked around the room, meeting each person's eyes. "I need a team. People who understand the risks and can follow instructions exactly. One mistake in the timing or placement, and instead of saving people, we could cause an avalanche." Dr. Martinez, the high school science teacher, stepped forward hesitantly. "I could help with the calculations, monitor the equipment." One by one, others volunteered. Pete from the fire department knew explosives. Sarah Chen could handle communications equipment. Even old Frank Morrison, whose own house was among the unreachable ones, insisted on helping despite his age. Sheriff Coleman threw his hands up in exasperation. "This is madness. We're talking about sending people out into a killing storm to set off bombs based on the theories of a—" He stopped himself, but the unfinished word hung in the air like an icicle. "Based on the theories of what?" Maya asked quietly, her voice cutting through the storm's noise. Coleman's face reddened. "I didn't mean—" "Yes, you did." Maya's voice remained steady, but Thomas could see the old hurt flickering in her eyes. "You were going to say crazy girl or weird kid or whatever other names you've been using for the past 15 years. The room was dead silent now, the weight of old prejudices settling like snow. Maya picked up her gloves from the table. "Here's the thing about being crazy, Sheriff. Sometimes crazy is just smart that hasn't been proven yet. And right now, crazy might be the only thing standing between your neighbors and freezing to death." She headed toward the door, her improvised team falling in behind her. "The question isn't whether my plan sounds insane," she called back over her shoulder. "The question is whether you're willing to let people die because you're too proud to trust the town freak." The storm had passed, but its aftermath left the town reeling. Maya stood in the central square, watching as townspeople emerged from their shelters like survivors of a shipwreck. The snow reached past her waist in places, and the silence was so complete it felt like the world had been wrapped in cotton. But they were alive, all of them. Dr. Henley approached through the drifts, his medical bag slung over his shoulder. His face bore the exhaustion of 3 sleepless nights, but his eyes held something Maya hadn't seen before, respect tinged with wonder. "I've checked every household," he said, his breath forming crystalline clouds. "Not a single case of frostbite, no hypothermia. Hell, the garrison baby's fever broke completely." He shook his head slowly. "That heating system of yours didn't just warm buildings, Maya. It created perfect environmental conditions, the humidity levels, the air circulation. It's like you engineered a medical miracle." Maya kicked at the snow, uncomfortable with the praise. "I just followed what made sense. Underground heat rises, pipes carry warmth where it needs to go." "No!" Sheriff Morrison's voice cut through the morning air as he trudged toward them. Behind him came a small procession: Mayor Davidson, Mrs. Chen from the general store, old Pete Kowalski, and dozens of others. Their faces held expressions Maya had never seen directed at her before. It wasn't just pipes and heat, Maya, it was vision. The crowd gathered in a loose circle around her, and Maya felt the familiar urge to retreat, but something in their faces held her still. These weren't the suspicious glances or dismissive looks she'd grown accustomed to. This was something else entirely. Mayor Davidson stepped forward, his usual political composure replaced by genuine emotion. "I owe you an apology," he said. "We all do. I spent months fighting your permit applications, calling your ideas dangerous, unconventional." His voice cracked slightly. "I was so focused on what could go wrong that I couldn't see what could go right." Mrs. Chen nodded vigorously. "My grandmother used to tell stories about her village in China, how they survived terrible winters by working together, sharing resources. I thought those days were gone, that we'd become too modern, too separate." She wiped at her eyes. "But you brought that back. You connected us." Maya looked around at the faces surrounding her, people who had whispered about the strange mountain girl, who had questioned her methods, who had treated her like an outsider. Now they stood before her with something approaching reverence, and it made her deeply uncomfortable. "I need to check the system," she said abruptly, turning toward the nearest access point. "Make sure there's no damage from the storm." But Sheriff Morrison caught her arm gently. "Maya, wait. There's something else." He gestured toward the road leading out of town, where tire tracks were barely visible in the deep snow. State emergency crews made it through an hour ago. Roads still impassable for most vehicles, but they brought news. Maya's stomach tightened. News usually meant complications. "Governors declared this a state disaster area," Morrison continued. "But here's the thing. Our town is being held up as a model. Word's gotten out about what happened here, how we survived when communities twice our size with proper emergency systems didn't fare as well." He paused, studying her face. "There are people who want to study what you built. Engineers, emergency management officials. They want to understand how a teenager, with no formal training, created something that outperformed million-dollar infrastructure projects." The crowd murmured agreement, but Maya felt panic rising in her chest. Attention meant scrutiny. Scrutiny meant questions she might not be able to answer. It meant people expecting her to explain intuition and instinct in ways that would satisfy their need for conventional logic. "I just want to go home," she said quietly. Dr. Henley stepped closer. "Maya, I know this is overwhelming, but what you've accomplished here, it's not just about saving our town. It's about proving that innovation doesn't always come from laboratories or universities. Sometimes it comes from necessity, from seeing problems differently." Old Pete Kowalski, who had barely spoken to Maya in all the years she'd lived on the mountain, shuffled forward. "My great-grandfather was an inventor," he said in his gravelly voice. "Back in the old country, people called him crazy too, said his ideas were too strange, too risky." He looked directly at Maya. "But when the floods came, his water management system saved 3 villages. Sometimes crazy is just another word for genius that nobody understands yet." Maya felt tears threatening and blinked them back fiercely. She wasn't used to kindness, especially not from these people, in this place that had never quite felt like home. "The system needs maintenance," she said again, but her voice lacked conviction. Sheriff Morrison smiled. "Then we'll help you maintain it, all of us, because now we understand. It's not just your system anymore, Maya. It's ours, and we're going to protect it the same way it protected us." The morning after the avalanche brought an eerie stillness that made Elena's ears ring. She stood at her cabin window, watching the rescue teams work methodically through the debris field where the Hendersons' house had been. Their voices carried across the snow, urgent but controlled, as they probed with long poles and listened for any sound beneath the white blanket. 3 days had passed since the mountain had shifted, and the town below looked like a war zone. Half the buildings on Maple Street were either collapsed or badly damaged. The community center's roof had caved in completely, and the old church bell tower leaned at a dangerous angle. But people were alive, more people than anyone had dared hope. "The geothermal network saved us," Dr. Morrison had told the emergency coordinator yesterday. "Without those heating stations, we would have lost dozens more to hypothermia in the aftermath." Elena pulled her coat tighter and stepped outside. The morning air bit at her cheeks, but the cold felt different now, manageable instead of murderous. Steam rose from vents scattered across the mountainside, marking the spots where her heating system continued to function despite the avalanche. Some pipes had been severed, but the network's redundancy meant warm air still flowed to most of the emergency shelters. She picked her way down the slope, following the path the rescue teams had carved through the snow. At the edge of town, she found Mayor Webb coordinating with the state emergency management team that had finally made it through the passes. His face looked 10 years older than it had 2 weeks ago, carved with new lines of exhaustion and responsibility. "Elena," he called when he spotted her. "Perfect timing. These folks want to talk to you." A woman in an official-looking parka extended her hand. "Sarah Chen, State Emergency Services. We need to understand your heating system, how it works, how we can replicate it. This isn't the first town we've seen devastated by extreme weather this winter." Elena nodded, unsurprised. The climate had been shifting for years, bringing harder winters and more unpredictable storms. What had happened here would happen elsewhere. "The geothermal principles are straightforward," she said, "but each location needs its own survey, its own network design. Would you be willing to consult? We have communities across the mountain region that could benefit from what you've built here." Before Elena could answer, a shout rose from the debris field. The rescue team had found something, someone. She watched as they worked carefully, clearing snow and broken timber with increasing urgency. A hand emerged, then an arm. Tom Henderson, alive but unconscious, was pulled from what had been his basement. The crowd that had gathered burst into ragged cheers. Elena felt tears freeze on her cheeks. In the past 3 days, they had recovered 7 survivors from the avalanche zone. Each rescue felt like a small miracle, a life snatched back from the mountain's appetite. "Your system kept the snow from freezing solid around the buried structures," Chen observed, watching the rescue unfold. "The radiant heat created air pockets, kept people from dying of exposure even when they were trapped." Elena hadn't planned for that application, but she wasn't surprised it had worked. Heat found its way into every space, every crack and crevice. It was persistent, like hope. Old Pete appeared at her elbow, moving more slowly than usual, but still determined to be part of everything important that happened in his town. "Heard they want you to go help other places," he said. "They're asking me to consider it." "Good. You should go." He paused, studying the rescue operation with sharp eyes. "But you should come back too. This place needs you, even if it took us too long to figure that out." Elena looked around at the damaged town, at the people who had dismissed her as crazy just weeks ago and now called her a hero. The truth was somewhere between those extremes, as it always was. She was simply someone who saw problems differently, who asked questions others didn't think to ask. "I'll need to train people to maintain the system here first," she told Chen. "And we'll need to expand it, improve it. The avalanche showed us some weak points. Of course, we're not in any hurry. Good engineering takes time." Another cheer went up from the rescue site. Tom Henderson's eyes had opened, and he was trying to speak. Elena watched his wife push through the crowd, saw their hands find each other across the stretcher. Another life saved, another family whole again. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of wood smoke and coffee from the emergency kitchens. Life going on, people taking care of each other in the way mountain communities always had. But now they had something extra. A network of warmth running beneath their feet, a system that would keep them safe when the next storm came. Because there would always be another storm. The mountain would always test them, but they would be ready. Elena turned back to Chen. "Let's talk about what other communities might need. But first, let me show you how the whole system works." The emergency council meeting convened at dawn in the town hall, its windows frosted over like blind eyes. Mayor Harrison's face bore the weight of impossible decisions as he surveyed the assembled crowd. Townspeople who had survived the night only because of Ezra's contraption, now clustering around tables laden with salvaged supplies and flickering oil lamps. "The State Highway Department confirms what we already suspected," Harrison announced, his breath visible in the frigid air. The main access road won't be cleared for another week, possibly longer. The backup generators at the medical center failed completely around midnight. A murmur of concern rippled through the assembly. Dr. Martinez stood up, her normally composed demeanor cracked with exhaustion. "We have 3 patients on life support who were transferred to manual ventilation during the night. Mrs. Chen's condition is stabilizing, but without consistent heat and power, we're looking at a crisis that extends far beyond what any of us imagined." From the back of the room, Ezra cleared his throat. All heads turned toward the young man who had become their unlikely salvation. His wild hair was even more disheveled than usual, and his clothes bore the stains of a sleepless night spent maintaining his heating system while simultaneously jury-rigging extensions to reach the most vulnerable households. "The thermal exchange network can be expanded," he said quietly, then louder as people strained to hear. "I've been calculating the load capacity since 3 this morning. If we sacrifice heating efficiency in some areas and create priority zones, we can establish a stable warmth grid for the entire downtown district." Sheriff Coleman leaned forward. "What would that require?" Ezra pulled out a crumpled piece of paper covered in diagrams that looked like the work of either a genius or a madman. Every piece of copper piping in town, all the insulation from the hardware store, and about 60 volunteers willing to dig trenches in frozen ground for the next 3 days straight. The silence that followed was punctuated only by the wind howling against the building's walls. Then Mrs. Patterson, whose arthritis had nearly crippled her during the cold snap, stood with difficulty. "My husband's shop has 30 feet of copper tubing in storage," she said. "Take whatever you need." One by one, others began offering resources. The Hendersons volunteered their truck for hauling materials. The teenage soccer team pledged themselves as a digging crew. Even Councilman Brooks, who had been Ezra's harshest critic just days before, quietly mentioned that the bank building had significant amounts of unused insulation in its renovation supplies. As the meeting transformed into a planning session, Ezra found himself at the center of organized chaos. People approached him with questions he had never imagined being asked, about pipe diameter, thermal coefficients and safety protocols for a system he had designed in desperate improvisation. "There's something else," Dr. Martinez said during a brief lull. "The CDC has been monitoring our situation through emergency channels. They want to document Ezra's heating system for potential emergency protocols in other isolated communities." The weight of that statement settled over the room. What had begun as one peculiar young man's unconventional solution to staying warm had become something larger, a blueprint for survival that might help others facing similar crises. But Ezra seemed less interested in recognition than in solving the immediate problem. He had spread his diagrams across 3 tables and was explaining the expansion plan to anyone willing to listen. His calculations covered everything from optimal trench depth to prevent freezing to pressure differentials that would ensure consistent heat distribution. "The beauty of thermal mass systems," he explained to a group of fascinated listeners, "is that they store energy and release it slowly. We're not trying to heat the air, we're warming the ground itself, turning the earth into a giant radiator." As work crews organized themselves and assignments were distributed, the transformation in the town's attitude toward Ezra became unmistakable. The same people who had whispered about his strange habits and eccentric projects now hung on his every word, recognizing that his apparent madness had been methodical preparation for a crisis none of them had anticipated. By noon, the sound of shovels hitting frozen earth echoed throughout the downtown area. Steam rose from multiple points where Ezra's original system had been tapped for expansion, and the complex network of pipes and thermal exchanges began to snake through the town like the circulatory system of some enormous organism. As evening approached, the first new sections came online. The library's reading room, which had been uninhabitable since the power failure, began to warm. The community center, designated as an emergency shelter, reached a temperature where people could remove their outer coats. Standing in the town square as darkness fell, Mayor Harrison watched steam rise from manholes and maintenance access points throughout the downtown area. The sight was otherworldly, as if the earth itself was breathing, exhaling warmth into the bitter mountain air. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight genius had revealed itself not as madness, but as salvation, wearing work clothes and carrying a shovel. The spring thaw came early that year, as if the mountain itself was eager to shed the memory of those brutal winter months. Water cascaded down the slopes in silver ribbons, and the first brave shoots of green pushed through the retreating snow. But in the town below, something far more profound was melting away, the rigid barriers that had once divided them. Maya stood at her workshop window, watching Dr. Hendrick's granddaughter help old Mrs. Chen repair her fence. The same girl who had once crossed the street to avoid the crazy hermit's granddaughter now sought Maya out regularly, hungry to learn about renewable energy systems. It was a transformation that still caught Maya off guard, even months after the crisis had passed. The knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. She opened it to find Thomas Brennan, the mayor's nephew, holding a rolled set of blueprints. "Maya, I wanted to show you something before we present it to the town council tonight," he said, his excitement barely contained. "We've been working on the expansion plans for the heating network." She invited him in, clearing space on her workbench as he unrolled the drawings. The plans were ambitious, a comprehensive system that would connect not just the town center but the outlying farms and even the old mining settlements higher up the mountain. It was everything she had dreamed of, but never dared propose. The engineering consultants from the city said it was impossible at first, Thomas explained, tracing the pipeline routes with his finger. "But when we showed them your original work, when they saw how you'd solved the pressure differential problem and the heat distribution calculations," he grinned. "They called it revolutionary. Said they'd never seen anything like it." Maya studied the plans, noting how they had built upon her foundation while adding refinements she hadn't considered. "This is beautiful work, Thomas. Who did the thermal efficiency calculations?" "Dr. Hendrick, actually. Turns out he'd been studying your system all winter, trying to understand how you'd achieved such remarkable heat output with minimal fuel consumption. He wants to co-publish a paper with you about it." The irony wasn't lost on her. Dr. Hendrick, who had once dismissed her as a dangerous dreamer, was now eager to share credit for her innovations, but she found she felt no bitterness about it. The winter had changed him too, humbled him in ways that made cooperation possible. Her grandfather appeared in the doorway, carrying 2 steaming mugs of tea. His health had improved dramatically since the crisis ended, as if having his faith in Maya vindicated had given him new life. "The delegation from the regional government is here," he announced. "They're down at the town hall." Maya had been expecting this visit. Word of their survival story had spread beyond the mountain, catching the attention of officials who saw potential applications for isolated communities throughout the region. What she hadn't expected was how nervous she felt about it. The town hall was packed when they arrived. Maya recognized most of the faces. Neighbors who had once viewed her with suspicion now looked at her with something approaching reverence. It was overwhelming in its own way. She preferred the honest skepticism of before to this hero worship. Governor Patricia Wells stood at the podium, a woman whose reputation for pragmatism preceded her. "What happened here this winter could have been a tragedy," she began. "Instead, it became a testament to human ingenuity and community resilience. We want to ensure that no other town faces what you faced, but we also want to learn from how you survived it." She outlined a proposal that took Maya's breath away: state funding for heating infrastructure, training programs to spread the technology, a research center dedicated to sustainable mountain living, with Maya as the lead engineer. When the governor finished, the hall erupted in applause. But Maya found herself thinking not of the accolades or opportunities, but of the night when Mrs. Patterson had knocked on her door, desperate and afraid. The night when everything changed. During the question period that followed, old Mr. Foster stood up, Maya braced herself, remembering his harsh words from the town meeting all those months ago, but his voice carried no trace of its former hostility. "I owe this young woman an apology," he said, his weathered hands gripping the back of the chair in front of him. "We all do. We were so busy looking at what made her different that we couldn't see what made her essential." He paused, scanning the room. "Genius looks like madness until it saves your life. We need to remember that." As the meeting wound down, Maya slipped outside for air. Her grandfather joined her on the steps, and they sat in comfortable silence, watching the last of the snow melt into rivulets that would feed the spring streams. "Are you ready for all this?" he asked, gesturing toward the building behind them, where the sounds of planning and possibility filled the air. Maya considered the question. Change was coming, recognition and responsibility in equal measure, but she had faced the mountain's fury and emerged stronger. Everything else seemed manageable by comparison. "Ready or not," she said, watching the water flow toward new destinations. "It's time."